This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you for coming. I'd like to thank David and Barbara Zalaznick for their generous donation that has made this reading series possible. If the universities are really modeled after the Greeks, then it is only fitting that we start today's event with an excerpt from Plato's Symposium, a time before modern science, a time before very needed queer studies or gender studies. The tools that the ancients had was basically just myth and metaphor. It's not really Plato I'd like to stress today, but actually a writer came about 2,800, 900 years later by the name of Ellison, who spoke about invisible people, or people who get very little respect, people who get very little representation. Today we have a panel, especially for those who study these issues. Today's reading will be followed by a panel as well as a Q&A. I won't take any more time because this event will be an hour and a half, so therefore, let me just welcome tonight with Ryka Aoki.
I seriously never thought I would come back here to read again. I mean, after my MFA thesis reading, it's been kind of a long time coming around. It's been kind of emotional. Quite some time ago, I earned my MFA here and gave my thesis reading. And, but anyway, I'd like to just thank the continued generosity of the Cornell MFA program and the English department. For an Ivy League school, y'all are pretty hip. Prologue. Archie could skip abstract on September through his office blinds, a watercolor paintbrush swirling pigments into vistas, simple and prime, an undisturbed inlet, short walk home. The napkin falling from hand to desk, on that current he could lift, then turn touching down and perfectly factored. I yearned to dally where the apples must taste like music, and prayer would cling to thistles to a mathematics that coordinates the sky. Yet here I am with child with deadweight metaphors and irrational feet. The mass of the universe enjambed within these hungering lines, with child, with want of child. Now am I as Archie wonders, even now he's singing, let's all gather at the river, the beautiful river, while I can only speak of motion, and how I so believe, yet cannot enroll her form. Poetry is where I've always felt most at home. However, home has always been complicated. Although I love the idea of being home, home itself was never a safe or viable place. And when somehow I was admitted right here to the Cornell MFA program, I discovered an environment so rarefied and magical that I thought I might finally get away. See, Cornell was like nothing I'd ever seen, at least in reality. I was stunned by how all the faculty live. You know how with all my heart. I wish for a future like theirs. Quiet office, a well-worn desk, some books, a comfy chair, and a window maybe overlooking some sort of courtyard garden. I had no desire to deal with ugliness, with violence. I wasn't thinking about revolution or justice. I just wanted escape. I wanted peace. Yet being at Cornell was far from peaceful. Most of the time I was frustrated. Not at my classmates, not even at the language poets or the cold winters, but at my own inability to become the writer that I felt I had to be, cultured and privileged and all brilliantly safe. Yet more than that, and the more I tried to be that ideal artist, the more I felt I was missing something vital. Ownership, self. It seemed like I was surrounded by people who knew who they were, their stations, and what they wanted to write. Me, pale imitations all. See, more than any other type of writing, I feel that poetry demands truth. There's nothing Hollywood glamorous about writing a poem. It's clumsy, stumbling most of the time, with generous heaps of self-importance and self-pity. But at least for me, the poem must contain truth. If I'm being evasive or lying, even unconsciously, the poem reacts. There's nothing like a poem to remind you who and where you are, even if you're not sure yourself. So I returned from Ithaca even more lost and confused. I was back where I started, with my one ticket out of town wasted. There would be no comfy office, no quiet courtyard, no peace. It was over. I most likely would have broken, but for one lucky act that saved me. I continued to write poetry. And somehow my constant probing for what was wrong with that poetry led me finally to realizing what I had wrong with me, which finally led me to realize that writing wasn't the only issue I had, because you see, after leaving Cornell, that's when I worried, and after wondering that I had the wrong voice, the wrong life, I found out I was transgender. And soon after that, my therapist helped me to admit to myself that I'd also been the victim of child abuse. Not the easiest process, but it was emancipating and strengthening. And with stronger spirit and new eyes, I look back at the poems that truly inspired me. Not the names, not the reputations, but the actual words. And I realized that my poems did not run away from their past. My favorite poems transformed them. After trying to write poetry from a perspective and privilege that I never had, I stopped trying to be somewhere else and someone else. I began to not concentrate on escaping my world, but transforming it. My time at Cornell, and even before that, my time home, began to fall into context, producing this new form and this richness. And gradually, a type of poetry began to come to my hand and heart and voice that I could finally call my own. See, in the past, I desired a poetry that offered escape from the pain and the nonsensical cruelty of the world. You know, forget this life. Somewhere in the chaos of the world, there has to be room for a pastoral quiet space where none of the outside matters. You can spend lifetimes waiting for a place like that. Yet, are we really interested in poems and poetry that come from such a space? While at Cornell, one of my professors once said that in the US, we kill our poets with kindness. At the time, I thought he was crazy, but now I realize his wisdom. Think about it. Why do poets seem to rise from places and spaces of oppression? Why do those who hunger for existence and significance and safety also seem to hunger for verse? In my hanging outs with other queers of color, I've become familiar with a pattern, one that resonates with my own life, where oppression is more than having nameable obstacles and villains. Life itself becomes the enemy, whether it's planning your trip around a non-existent gender-neutral bathroom or taking 4 hours to run a 20-minute errand because the bus is late. Life itself is oppressive when the only thing that seems to have any regularity are the bills or the insults or the panic attacks that keep you awake every night. Oppression is the extra pain you feel in your bladder, the sodden feeling you get when someone accuses you of going to McDonald's when it's the only way you can afford to take your kids out on a meal where there's air conditioning. Oppression reduces conflict and meaning to an impersonality that can pummel a soul until even its existence loses meaning. For when societies and institutions operate on statistical scales, where on earth is there room for the personal? What gives the self its significance? At times such as this, it is not the body that most thirsts or hungers, but the soul. We can do far more if we simply know that we matter, that there is significance in who we are and in what we do. And this is where I finally realized that poetry sings. Unlike the weightiness of essays or prose, poems can be portable, personal things. Poetry links us not through our shared philosophies or stories, but through the minutiae of our day-to-day existences. A poem can bring seemingly endless, stupid craziness to a personal human scale, at least for a while, providing space for contemplation and reflection, and maybe even a little peace. In Ars Poetica, Archibald MacLeish writes, for all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf. One doorway, not a labyrinth of closed doors. One leaf, not a forest of lost opportunity. Poetry is one of the few ways we can transform the broadband of oppression into something manageable. It does this by insisting that one's personal experiences, one's personal world, they don't merely exist, they embody their existence. We don't have to measure ourselves against the global or universal. Our existences themselves are enough to connect and sanctify us. Poems remind us that we are significant, not because of how much land we own or how many guns we have, but who we intrinsically are. This is a world where some children laugh and others are beaten, where some children are cast out, others blend right in, where some have clean water and bed sheets, where we force our activists into ignoring their health, our artists to give up before they turn 25, where people are so addled, so shell-shocked and overwhelmed that they protest their own health insurance, where there are picnics and beaches and fireflies and even ice cream. This is the world where poetry most matters, not through its ability to offer escape, but its ability to transform one's surroundings and link even God and eternity to one's coffee mug search for a shopping list, significance, and truth. A philosopher once asked if I believed in God. My friend lost 2 friends, and one of them was my friend, and so was another. And in the morning, I could kiss you, not to wake you, but to linger a little, resting a bit where my nose still brushed your neck. And yes, I was crying, because you stirred and smiled, and we were still going shopping, and it was still not even May. A philosopher once asked if I believed in God. I said, no, I have experience. And so even now, I can disbelieve all I want, but I shall always know that I would want another night next to you, breathing, dancing on byways, no matter how afraid. Up overhead, we peered at what snuggled the side of a Griffith Park ravine. We identified it with an app you downloaded from the cloud, then snipped a sprig of showy evening primrose to dream of planting in our someday backyard, or at least until the allergies set in. I'm writing a speech to tell a group of earnest undergrads something hopeful and life-affirming. How does one say, trim just a little bit of flesh, the glass slipper will fit, you'll get to the ball and dance with the prince? Feet blister, mouths are bleeding rubber, and come, the backbeat fades to cross-reference cross-gendered graves. Jesus fucking Christ, she was only 22 years old. You shh me. Say, it's 4 a.m., and you'll be awake where you are. In the come and go of neutrinos, house cats, a sweetheart's notes, and schoolyard beating, there is not enough courage in my hand, but for the courage I hold in yours. What beatifies leftover lo mein, styrofoam, chopsticks, plastic forks, 2 napkins, 3 packs of crappy soy sauce that neither of us will use? You slog home drenched and empty from work you swear you only do for the money, but we both know otherwise. Rent's increasing 4.5%. LA wants $61.42 in taxes we don't owe. What trip to Paris? We're hoping to visit the supermarket between paychecks. Leftovers for the wok, leftovers for the stock pot, leftover rice, leftover bok choy. Yesterday, I yearned for when I could buy a bag of salad without caring how quickly the freshest greens spoil. Yesterday, I yearned for clean dishes, a clean refrigerator. But yesterday, I could tell you how someone waited a little longer to hold the elevator door, how the Walgreens clerk heard me sniffle and say, I hope you feel better. Or that helpful woman at the post office saying, oh, people forget the postage rates all the time. And today, as I entered the liquor store, an actor rushed past me to buy lemon drops, then dashed to the theater next door. I bought a 2-liter of Diet Coke, 3 cans with sardines and tomato sauce, and stammered, 감사합니다, to the shop owner who knew I said it wrong, yet smiled and nodded, completely and simply to me. One can forge documents, reinvent identities, concatenate acronyms, be lost in our flags and our labels and our unfilled prescriptions and lists of the dead. Yet though the cure for cancer may not cure cancer, or suicide, or a trip to the doctor, who will whisper, I'll go with you, be scared with you, trust what you say, and always, always be here? When two spirits peer into moonless native sky. When transsexuals primp for conjugal visit with surgeon and syringe. When I am writing even now as she ended, someone was there to make sure her nails are absolutely perfect. Who turns off my phone, closes my laptop, gets a popsicle to ease my sore throat? Who are we? What is this? I think I am. What is this but that and all that I give? I am yours. I am yours. I am yours. Build with me. Walk with me. Grow old and tired and share supper with me. And with you I light a candle. And with you I reheat the noodles. Or so we hope. We hope when we are weak we can say we know what it feels like to truly love. Today a sparrow was perched on the banana tree, so the hummingbirds were probably too frightened to land. And near the galaxy's core, a black hole stripped a pearl blue star into ribbons of fire and poetry is all one has strength to hear. When we don't have enough daylight to waste even a little food, leftovers go to stir fry. Stir fry becomes soup, and soup is what a lover needs after a lifetime of saving the world. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Cornell program.
Thank you, Ryka. Let's welcome the author of She's Not the Man I Married, as well as my husband, Betty. It is a pleasure for me to introduce to you someone I've known since we were together in college. We weren't friends or anything, but we definitely crossed, and it's amazing that she's here, Helen Boyd.
I'm not reading anything from my published work because I've been working on 18 projects at once, like you do, during long winters. I live in Wisconsin, which gives us far too much time to think and too much time to drink. So I just wanted to read a couple of short pieces because one of the books is basically a kind of meditation on masculinity. It's called Men I Have Known. He must have been shopping for my mother's Christmas present, except that I don't remember it was actually Christmas. That is the only thing that might explain why my father was shopping with me only, and why it was so crowded at TSS that night. There was a rush of human beings around us, and I was the kind of small that I saw humanity as an army of knees and legs and belts and hands. I was double-stepping to keep up with him. I clung to his hand like a prehensile kite, light as nothing and skipping and running because he was in a hurry, which meant he wasn't as happy as he could be. When he was happy, my father moved at a leisurely pace, and when he was really happy, he didn't move much at all. I was the youngest and easy to convince to go anywhere. My dad and I spent most of the time we spent together driving. By the time I was a teenager, it was a break for both of us from our mess of a family. I don't remember us ever talking much about anything. Mostly we listened to music, and I'm sure he regretted the day I was old enough to insist we not listen to the old people station he preferred. He put up with new wave even when he mocked it. He called Slip Disc, my favorite record store, Broken Back. He thought he was funny. But he got his turn too. He was so pleased with himself for working out how crude the Cramps' Kiss My Ass was because it gave him a reason to put Benny Goodman back on. He was being a responsible parent after all. I remember it being really, really late out that night, but I bet it wasn't. In the whoosh of people coming and going through the revolving doors, I lost his hand for a second and then reattached myself, a Homo sapiens grasping instinctually. But I picked the wrong hand, or the hand of the wrong man, a man who wasn't my father. I didn't notice. I just kept up my skipping and walking, skipping and walking, walking and skipping until I saw my father approaching me. Only then did I wonder whose hand I was holding and how he was holding it for so long. Maybe he'd seen my father looking for me before I knew he was missing and brought him to me. I don't know. But I was transferred from the strange man's hand to his. It took all of my hand to grasp only two of his fingers. I have no idea if we bought anything at all that night, but I still don't think it was Christmas. But I can't think of any other reason we would have been shopping, just the two of us, in a department store past dusk. It was one of the Husser boys who took me to the creek to show me the blinded kitten. It wasn't blind from birth. Someone had gouged its eyes. It was stumbling around in a stupor, in so much shock and pain it was silent and didn't even meow for help. It was a hot sun above us, and the creek stank like brine. I ran home and got cat food. This boy, whoever he was, we'll call him Russell for now, stayed with the kitten. He tried to feed the kitten after I did. We switched off a few times, but the kitten only staggered in half circles. I don't know why I didn't bring it home. We had pets. I remember thinking I should kill it, but I didn't have the heart and had no idea how. I went home again and told my mother. Russell came with me. She told me it wouldn't eat, that nature would take care of it. And she was probably right, but I was 9 and fearless and compassionate and always right, just the way 9-year-old girls often are. It wasn't there when I got back with the milk. My mom said it had probably drowned itself. The creek smelled like the milk had already gone bad. You're the nicest person I've ever met, Russell offered. I didn't help much, I said. He tried, he encouraged. And that was when I started to wonder if he'd been the one who'd hurt the kitten. I haven't stopped. I'm gonna lighten things up and read a little bit something about mourning. You don't always make the best decisions in the wake of a death. Sometimes you have sex with someone you'll never have sex with again because it seemed like the right thing to do at the time. You might drink too much. Skip that, you drink too much. You might spend too much money on clothes or dye your hair a new color or get a tattoo. You might decide you're working in the wrong industry altogether and quit your job or move clear across the country. You might sit in your room at 3 a.m. and watch Deep Space Nine for 4 hours solid. You might wonder about that guy you dumped 15 years ago and wonder too how it was you managed to keep sleeping with him despite your inability to agree with him about anything at all, and realize that you probably haven't had that much sex since then. Well, maybe. You might surprise yourself by spending an hour digging out your middle school yearbook only to remember that when you're shoulder deep in boxes sitting half in and half out of your closet that you lost that yearbook years ago. You might wonder if your mom got buried with that ring she found that she was convinced he'd bought her for Christmas, but that you were convinced he'd bought for their 60th anniversary, which he didn't make it to. You wonder whether or not you will be younger or older than your mother when she gave up living. You wonder how it is she didn't remember the entire year after her husband died, and you wonder if you'll remember this year that's now ending. You are pretty sure you don't want to. You stop dead in the street when you see a cardinal in the tree. You try to remember what that means and in what culture it means it. It's a sign that your loved one is nearby, but is that in some symbolic sense, or is the cardinal supposed to be some reincarnated version? Are cardinals always representatives of dead people, or are they just birds sometimes? Because I live where they live, so I'm either being plagued by dead people or it's just spring. You eat whatever you feel like eating. A muffin for dinner seems reasonable. A turkey pot pie for breakfast is also reasonable. You work out in a regimented and unenthusiastic way, but discover after 4 weeks that you can actually do 100 push-ups, that it worked, but you don't really care or feel any sense of accomplishment. You feel disposable. You wonder when someone tells you that you look beautiful, whether or not you can tell that you're also dead inside, or if being dead inside is part of what makes you beautiful. You remember every disappointment, every betrayal, every loss from a death reminds you of 15 other kinds of losses. You save muffin wrappers for your old cat who has discovered an inexplicable joy in muffin wrapper licking. You drink too much. You wonder if you think about your mom being dead too much, enough, or not enough. You wonder if you have unresolved feelings about her, even though you've spent most of your life realizing unresolved feelings for her. You think about the joy on her face when she gave you your first bike. You wonder if that guidance counselor who asked your mother if you were in a cult because you were wearing African mask earrings is still asking parents stupid shit like that. Your mother bought you the earrings, of course. You wonder if you will ever stop feeling sad. You wonder if the friends who are there for you are there because they like you or because they kind of feel sorry for you. You wonder if now, with both parents dead, there is some astonishing reality about yourself you are about to uncover. You hope there is. You hope there isn't. You think about calling or emailing someone who really let you down to give them what for. You wake up as if from a trance after watching 20 minutes of goat videos. You do not feel better, but you are sure you like goats. You wonder if your cats can tell when the dead are visiting and simply choose not to notice them or inform you that they're present. Occasionally, you are certain that they can see the ghost of a loved one right behind your head because they are obviously staring at something that is just to the left of your right ear. You assume that other people maybe don't have as much sexual regret in their lives, or that they have a lot more, or that for some people sadness doesn't mean re-examining your sexual orientation, your sexual choices, or excoriating yourself for not sleeping with that very cute woman when you could have. She wanted you, you were scared she wanted a girlfriend, you couldn't be her girlfriend, so you didn't sleep with her, but you wonder if you should have anyway, and whether you should really stop considering every last ethical ramification of every possible flirtation, crush, or love affair you've ever had. You wonder if there is anyone in the world who might understand how it feels to hear your mom's voice on your voicemail still, her beautiful sing-songy way of talking, the message she left you only a week or so before she died. You are still amazed at how much she radiated happiness on the phone even when she wasn't, and how when you were a kid she could go from screaming about what a mess this place is to answering the phone with the joy and melody of a bluebird, as if she'd become a different person in that split second. You realize you will never hear her say anything new to you. You wonder if anyone knows that you have kept your hair blue for a year because it was the last color she saw it. No one would have noticed if you'd worn black every day. You know she would appreciate you taking the time to live out this Catholic rite, even if it was with blue hair and not black clothes. You wonder if you remember the rosary and if it really would make you feel any better if she insisted it did your entire life. Your grandmother did too, and you wonder how long she's been dead, because once you're mourning your parents, every kind of ghost of your life pays a short visit at least once. You don't even bother to try to find the rosary. Here is the blanket my grandma crocheted. Here are my mom's pajamas I wore. Here is my father's sweater, which is still surprisingly cooler than almost every sweater I own. You take a lot of baths, so you forget to bathe for days at a time. If you realize it's only been 3 days, you decide you can wait another day. You come to the same conclusion the next day because memory is no longer your strong suit, and you walk around on a lot of Wednesdays thinking it's Tuesday and vice versa. You become certain that taking a probiotic, vitamin C, valerian fish oil, whatever, has really made a difference in your health. You say, I hate children with a hint of rage, even though you don't actually mean it, and regret it for weeks and wonder if you should explain that you don't really hate them to the person you said it to, or if that would be protesting too much. It's not really children anyway, it's how sticky they are and how the world revolves around them that you hate. You decide to explain what mourning is like to that person who you told you hated children to, so that maybe they understand, and you add a smiley face to the email as if that will make you seem less crazy, though the opposite is probably true. You wonder again about unresolved issues. You can't seem to fake a smile or even work up the energy for anger, your most stalwart companion. You feel mean and unapologetically so, except the next day when you wish you could be a nicer, more upbeat sort of person. You realize no one wants to have sex with a sad person, not even you. You drink too much. You wonder why so many people like Klingons so much when they're really just patriarchal. Robin Williams was once told that Coke makes you more like yourself, and so he asked, but what if you're an asshole? Mourning is the same as Coke. I still don't know how to do this, to live in a world where the woman with the brightest voice and the brightest smile, who is fearful in a way that made her so old, and yet gave you a glimpse into how she must have been when she was 7, is dead. I am still in that room with her, sitting and holding hands with her, the TV on or off, the trees and flowers blooming outside, as she lay dying in the spring. She loved spring so much, but the sun on her face almost hurt her in the end, and the cool breeze was an affront that no sweater could ameliorate. She was already in mourning the whole time I was waiting to be. I am pretty sure I don't know how to do this, and probably never will. I am also sure I will be doing this for the rest of my life, in one way or another. Okay, last bit, finally some gender, or more gender. I've recently been reading Lou Sullivan's biography, which I highly recommend, and I'm having trouble with it because some of it cuts too close to the bone for me. I'm not sure how he came to understand he was a gay man when there was little or no awareness of either gay men or trans men, but he did, and I'm astonished by that. I've been hanging out on the edges of gender dysphoria my whole life, but never really named it that. Genderqueer, gender neutral, gender fuck, these were the words I started using to talk about myself back in 1985. There's a photo of me in boy drag from when I was 16 and found out I would have been named Doug and had I been assigned male at birth. My nickname in high school was the gentleman, not because of my class, but because I opened doors and took care of women in ways that more closely resembled gentle masculinity than anything else. I feel sexiest when I feel like Rufus Wainwright. Feminine forms of sexy have never ever appealed to me, not when I was skinny, not when I was fat, not when I was an hourglass. I've spent a lifetime trying to make curves straight lines with little success. Only now that I'm older and lose muscle mass at an alarming rate have my jeans started to fit my hips in ways I don't hate. I have always resisted identifying as trans, maybe because I grew up raised by second-wave feminists who wanted to get rid of gender for good and feminist reasons. Maybe because I grew up in an era of trans activism where people who needed medical and legal intervention really, really, really needed the healthcare industry and legal precedents to be recognized in order for them to be people at all. Priorities, you know? Maybe it's because I was just new wave and everyone had a complicated gender in the 1980s because as a culture we'd made room for them. A very pretty, very feminine, foul-mouthed and slightly drunk friend greeted me recently with, "Helen, you Boy George son of a bitch." And I took it as a reprimand about both my style and my gender and later thought, well, fuck yeah. I am the same gender as Boy George, just really from the other direction. In a nutshell, it's hard to say. I look at the mix of internal feelings that make me unhappy about my gender, and I look at the forces from the external world that make me unhappy with my gender, and I wonder if that makes a difference at all. Who really cares? We're born this way and aren't to become this way, but the one thing I can tell you is that my gender has always been a goddamn problem. I have never understood how to dress or to sit or how to be, and even as a child, I'd be going along swimmingly, you know, playing with my Barbies and adoring an occasional dress or keeping a pair of white jeans extraordinarily clean, and then yet I'd do or say something or be something that would cause that look on adults' faces, and I would know I had transgressed. I have spent a lifetime having people tell me I'm feminine when I say something about my masculinity, and a lifetime having people remind me of my masculinity when I was trying to make peace with being a woman. I've had to explain to the men that I dig that I'm not a lesbian, that queer means something else altogether. A friend spent years introducing me as the straight girl who made her gay, and I really was that at the time. Gender identity and sexuality are different things, folks, and some of us in this room have known that for years, but goddamn, I wish the world would catch up. I don't know why it took Lou Sullivan to shake this out of me. I've always been worried about it in fits and starts, and I've often said that once you meet a trans partner, you only have to scratch the surface to find out they've also got gender in big ways. Sometimes just a lot of it, sometimes not enough of it, sometimes just a queer gender, but almost always partners of trans people have their own complicated relationship with gender. Of course, we all do, in one way or another, whether we seek to confirm what they told us to be or to subvert it, but living around and with, and honestly for trans people, brings a whole new level to the way you live in the world. I've been reluctant. Auntie Kate told me I was trans a long time ago on a day when I helped her carry her luggage for an event in Brooklyn. She took a photo of me with her phone and told me to look at it. I felt unseen, overinterpreted, not me, but she kept saying it, kept loving me for this masculinity of mine, and maybe it's the diminishing returns of estrogen in my system as I approach menopause, but now I may finally be ready to admit it. I like myself most when I look like a well-dressed, overread, overwrought, middle-aged dyke who will tell you what for. I'm still in the process of becoming that, and let me tell you, being this person as someone who dates men, for the most part, is a pain in my ass, and it always has been. I became an ally in public, which was both humiliating when it wasn't horrible, but I never could have been just an ally. When my wife and I first met, I was more than thrilled to cross-dress and to cross-gender, to transgender, as we used to say. And it was, in some ways, my wife's abandonment of the liminal areas of gender that left me feeling alone in my marriage. Her transition, you could say, but more so her move away from the borderlands and back to binary identity. Not long ago, a photographer who didn't know us or our story came to take a photo of us for a thing. He looked at us closely, trying to suss who was the trans one, a phenomenon we're both used to and don't interfere with, and then made his decision by asking my wife how long it took her to get used to having a genderqueer partner. We thought a little about not correcting him because we're dicks like that, but we knew the folks doing the project would have been mad at us. They wanted a trans woman and her loving wife, which, yeah, we are that too. Sometimes we're still that when people assume I'm the trans woman. Rachel, I can tell you, is a shitty ally to the trans community in comparison, being as she is conflicted with being trans in the first place. I will continue to insist that I am not trans. I don't know what I am. I use these words that attempt to suggest what I might be: genderqueer, non-binary, gender neutral, a bad man, to borrow from Ursula Le Guin. But I will leave the word itself to you all who find yourselves in it. I still don't, but you know, fuck gender. Fuck it right in the ear.
No, Helen and I were at City College at the same time that Bell Hooks and Michelle Wallace were teaching there. So it was a big block, and that's the block that Helen would hang out with. And I was always afraid because I'm writing all these macho stories in Spanish Harlem, And once in a while, Helen would say, "What are you writing?" I would say, "Grocery lists." Anyway, true. Let's welcome Ely Shipley.
Okay, I'm going to read a bit of this new book that just came out, Some Animal. And the piece I'm going to read is called On Beards, and it's the last section. And just to give you a sense of it, it's a lot of, the form is sort of collage. There's poems, so there are parts that are broken into lines, and then there are parts that are prose. It's very hybrid. And in addition to that, it's memoir, as well as there's like queer theory in here. There's history, anthropology, in particular medical anthropology, pop culture, documentary, letters from therapists, and some canonical poets like Chaucer and Allen Ginsberg make appearances. So I'm going to start on Beards with a quote from Judith Butler, and this is from Undoing Gender. FTM candidates actually practice the narrative of gender essentialism they're required to perform before they go in to see the doctors. The price of using the diagnosis to get what one wants, one cannot use language to say what one really thinks is true. One pays for one's freedom, as it were, by sacrificing one's claim to use language truthfully. Ancient Egyptians and Romans let their beards and hair grow out when grieving. Conversely, Greeks shaved and cut theirs. This may have evolved into the ritual of 18th century English widows covering or even cutting their hair after a husband's death. When she becomes he, people are confused. Some are even angry. For example, his girlfriend's mother gets so flustered one day, she begins to call him it. He's been called it before. In 7th grade, first period math, she slumps forward in her seat, hides behind the hair she's been growing. It's a tent that whispers against the back of her thighs when she walks. The teacher never calls on her. She never raises her hand. She is safe. No one ever asked cousin it, "What are you, a boy or a girl?" She's reluctant to change clothes. Most days she sneaks into the stall to change, even though it's forbidden. The coaches linger at the edge of the bathroom, watch for shorts sliding down over sneakers, pooling on the floor. On the toilet seat, she balances carefully, a circus act for an acrobat, a bearded lady. A portrait reveals 18-year-old Annie Jones, one of P.T. Barnum's bearded ladies, hair pulled back and tied by a black ribbon. Her face is fully exposed, though more than half of it is covered by her enormous beard and thick dark eyebrows. She wears a long fur coat that reaches her knees, where a dress adorned with large flowers flares out, then ends at the bottom, a ruffle along the seam. The fur coat looks less like fur and more like the long wavy tresses of a mane, an extension of her hair and beard. She's nearly completely covered in hair, except for her shadowy eyes, which look to her side, into the distance, the field of her flowery dress. Her thin fingers rest delicately together over a long piece of fabric broadening out from behind her. Hair does not continue to grow after death. Tissues around it, especially on the face, contract and expose it, giving the dead their 5 o'clock shadow. We're painting pictures. When I draw, I'm in another world. Painting is different. The watercolors move out of my control. I've already dripped a fat black drop onto my self-portrait. I begin to move the brush along the jawline in the papery mirror. I spread the thick mistake into a beard. Mrs. Hertz passes my table and pauses. "Oh, look, how wonderful. That must be Abraham Lincoln. Is that Abraham Lincoln? Look, children, blank is painting one of our most important presidents." I'm the shyest student in my class. I never speak. The kids will laugh. But I like the way my face looks out at me through its beard. I keep my eyes on my face, nod my head, and begin to paint a long line across its forehead. A dark, cloudy frown will become a stovetop hat. He will need more than a beard if he's really going to be Abraham Lincoln. A few weeks later, at open house, my parents and I arrived to find Abraham Lincoln wearing a long and shiny blue ribbon. He's won first prize for the annual district contest. Everyone is smiling, except Abraham Lincoln. I look at him, he stares through me. Axis 4, problems related to the social environment. Difficulty being accepted in social environment due to incongruence between expressing masculinity and lack of masculine physical attributes. And that's from a letter from a therapist to an endocrinologist and sex reassignment surgeon in accordance with the Harry Benjamin Standards of Care and the DSM-4. And this is from a Greek saying, there are two kinds of people in this world that go around beardless, boys and women. I am neither one. In gay slang, the word beard is used to describe a woman who is a cover for a gay man's orientation. She, the beard, is used to hide his identity by accompanying him in public so that he might pass for straight. Beards were often worn as a form of protection. A parallel word, though used less commonly to describe a man who appears in society as a cover for a lesbian, is not a beard but a merkin. And this is from the Oxford English Dictionary. An artificial covering of hair for the female pubic region, a pubic wig for women, also an artificial vagina. Merkin is also slang for female genitals. It's said that a merkin was originally worn by prostitutes who had to shave their pubic hair when they contracted a disease. He visits a gynecologist before his hysterectomy, a procedure trans men are advised to have within the first few years of hormone replacement therapy because they're at a heightened risk for cancer in the female reproductive organs. The doctor points at his pelvis, says, "Don't worry, you won't have to shave all that hair." Then asks if he wants to see his cervix, tells him, "Take a look, it's really cool. It's like you have a penis, a big swollen penis head." He looks up and watches the bulbous organ, which seems to float inside the watery black TV, suspended over him and magnifying everything. It is a planet in a grade school science fair planetarium, Jupiter angled up as if to breathe. It is a pinkish whale arcing its blowhole out from under the viscous water. He reminds himself to breathe so that he will not pass out. Farewell with your old dress and a long black beard around the vagina. That's from Allen Ginsberg's Kaddish. My mom and I sit on the couch and look at old family photos. In one, I am sitting on Santa's lap. I wear a faux fur coat. It is striped black and white. I am something polar bear and zebra under pigtails. I'm crying. What did I look out and see? A flash of white light, spotlight, lighthouse beam crossing over a drowned body, and after, a ghost, some dream, thin trace of lightning. Santa's eyes loom large over his beard. They are brown, his lashes thick and long, his eyebrows thin, black pencil lines. Face smooth and slight. His beard is not a part of it. His beard is a white mask, a shroud. His hands, cold, gloved, a surgeon's. Even though you were so young, my mom says, I think you could tell something wasn't right. And finally, she says, that Santa was really a woman. So that's, again, excerpts from a longer piece. It's hard to, it kind of works in this way of accumulation. It's sort of a cruise meaning as you go. So it's hard to excerpt from. So that's just one sort of thread. And I wanted to share with you also a kind of newish poem, just to give you a taste of the other kind of style I write in. And this poem is, the title is a Sanskrit word, kosha, which roughly means layers of self. I think there are 5 different koshas, but it's kind of like there's the sort of gross body, like the material body, and then there's the energy body, and so on. And I like the Sanskrit word kosha so much better than just saying sheaves of self. It doesn't have the same ring, and it's kind of reductive. So, steam light across a field, flowering a sun. At the horizon are armed silhouettes, stalks of long grass folding, the hair of a girl child gone somewhere now to make spiders' webs or birds' nests. A thin willow branch braids down my back. Once I was a stone, no mouth, no eyes. I bent over to pick a yellow leaf from the ground. I knew one day I would die alone. With it, I covered my mouth to cough, even when alone, always polite to gods in disguise. I held doors open and looked beggars in the eyes. I watched kites float just there over a shore, let snow melt into my open mouth, let it burn along my nerves. I bent my skeleton from side to music. I clothed my skeleton in a single teal scarf, held the hand of another, poured bourbon into a teacup, a blue pasture painted around its rim, a candle between thumb and forefinger doused. Walked dogs through city night insomnia, watered young vegetables in my father's garden, picked a tick from my dog's neck, held a crying infant to my chest, a lover in orgasm, palms to my chest, made bread, washed a lover's hair, brushed a lover's hair, braided a lover's hair, combed the forest floor for a familiar face in pools of rain, read tarot to tables of strangers, sliced bread, grew tired in the afternoon, napped like a dog at the feet of a mistress who read in bed and, from a can, ate sardines, imagined my thin skeleton encased in slick skin sliding down the length of her body, pressed my fevered cheek against the cool window of a storefront church, remembered ice skating a frozen stream, and whispered the names of the ones I beg forgiveness from, and one I long to forgive. Thank you.
Thanks, Eli. I'd like to invite Joshua Cole, PhD candidate from Performing Arts, to the panel, as well as our very own Masha Raskolnikov, Associate Professor of English. This will be a panel of questions and answers, and in about 15-20 minutes, they'll open it up to the audience for questions.
So what a pleasure to have you join us here in Ithaca. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming back. I wanted to introduce myself just a little bit. I'm Masha Raskolnikov. I teach in the English department. I teach Chaucer. I was teaching Chaucer today. I was hoping you'd read something from what you do with Chaucer. I want to know. But I also teach classes that are occasional classes on transliterature. I am a cis lesbian. There's no particularly good reason why I am the main person that teaches transliterature on this campus. And we should really, really hire some trans people. But given that that is the case, I started out teaching a general translit class. And then I realized that that was too much literature, and so then I taught a class just on femininity because I was wanting to center the work of trans femmes. So that's my background, and I'm also now the editor of a volume with two friends called Trans Before Trans. When what we do is look at literatures before 1800, which is usually the starting point for us talking about trans stuff, where we look at literature before 1800 to see how transgender and genderqueer bodies and lives were represented. That's sort of what I'm here for. I want to ask questions of the panelists, but I want Cole to introduce himself first.
Hello, I'm Joshua Ashton Cole. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of Performing and Media Arts. I mostly work on cinema, particularly science fiction cinema, and its potential overlaps with trans cinema. Oh yeah, I was introduced as a candidate. I'm not quite a candidate yet, but on the way there. I don't want to take too much time. You can just jump into questions from here. If you want to go first.
Well, okay, so I wanted to, here's the thing. We're gathered here, dearly beloved, at Cornell University, with some really lovely writers, and I want them to talk about their craft, because I don't think that there is necessarily any trans-specific thing that we could track between these three writers, and I actually really don't want to do that. I think that'd be wrong. That said, I want to talk a little bit about the political crisis that we find ourselves in today, and I want to see if these writers, from their different vantage points and their different ways, are finding their writing being changed by the intense sense of threat that we all feel, but that are particularly happening to trans communities. I just met someone who did not remember this already, but you might remember that in November of this year, the Centers for Disease Control scientists were given a list of 7 words that they could no longer use in applications for funding if they hoped to get funding as part of the CDC. Those words included the word transgender. They also included the word vulnerable. And the forbidding of those very words haunts me every day. So I just thought I would turn the microphone over. I want to go.
I can go. Or, I think the first thing when you started that question that struck me was just how overwhelmed and depressing, and so, but also how urgent. And I think, for as shitty as it's and difficult as it's been to be a queer trans person in the world, on a good day, I feel very grateful because I think that I have a perspective that maybe, I wouldn't say, most people don't have, or if they have it, they don't realize it, because we're all gendered people and we all are limited even by our gender or the kind of expectations of that. So the first thing that occurred to me was just that I think that writing, in particular writing poems, has saved my life. I mean, I kind of wonder, like, if I hadn't been born a queer, trans person, if I would even write poems. And so I think that because of the current sort of political situation, it's just, for me, kind of turned the volume up on the urgency to do my writing practice as a way of surviving, as a way of praying, and I think as a way of continuing to heal and to connect with other people who are experiencing the same vulnerability and threat, and so that's what occurs to me, just the urgency and maybe the kind of why bother with doing this anyway, and it is really about the practice of writing for me that maybe survival is really tied up in.
So, a lot of times when I'm writing, I write for 2 people. I write for me, and then I write for the person who needs my work. I don't know who that person is. I don't know where they live. I don't even know if they're alive yet. But I think that, books came to me and saved my life. I don't think the author ever knew that I depended on them, and I want to return the favor. One thing about being transgender is that there's an immediacy to your work. People have come up to me, and we were talking, have come up and said, your book saved my life. That poem was the only thing in the world that spoke to me at a given time. It's hard to hear that and not take your craft seriously. So, but it also does change the way you work with your audience. I remember in Poetry Workshop here, we were talking about how Langston Hughes would changed his metaphors, changed the way he worked to better connect with his audience when he was barnstorming. And I spent a lot of my early writing, before the books were out, barnstorming around the country. To a point, I still do. And sometimes the choice of wording I use, the choice of metaphor I use, maybe the choice of form I might use, the cadence might reflect the audience that I'm speaking towards. It's not a dumbing down. What it is, it's a refining of my work to better reach the voice of the people that I care about. One thing as a writer that we can do is that I think as poets, I think we spend a lot of time thinking about the deeper meaning of circumstance as it comes to us. So when it does come time for us to speak, I don't know, speaking for myself, everyone here, we're all kind of basically introverts. We don't, it sounds like we say a lot, we've got books, but we don't tend to say anything until we've thought it through. And so when we're working and when we write, a lot of times in an environment where people are flashing and tweeting and doing all these off-the-cuff reactions, even people who are fighting for, say, human rights, trans rights, a lot of times they'll miss some of the nuance. So sometimes as a writer, I feel in some ways I'm a recorder, an articulator, and in some ways even a record keeper of some of the deeper issues that might be affecting us as we go through. So maybe some of the connections don't get lost in the swath of tweets or reactions or, thumbs ups or likes or dislikes.
Interesting point of comparison. I've been blogging for a very long time, and I think in some ways almost the opposite is that I feel like one of the responsibilities I have in working with students, I teach at Lawrence University out in Wisconsin, but also with the people who I know to be my readers. It's been a very long time since the first book. I have to respond immediately when things happen politically and try to kind of address an issue, not maybe as quickly as I possibly can, but in some ways that allows people to know that very specific people can hear them. I think sometimes when I watch, especially with my wife, the news about things like, the numerous bathroom bills were proposed. She is a funny, confident, extrovert actor of a person, like unbelievable, exhausting to be with really for 10 minutes. I'm not sure how we got married, but incredible and amazing and bright, and so much brings so much light into other people's lives. And when I watch her go quiet, it's nothing horrible has happened, just the news, because she's a news junkie. I feel like I have to go, when I see that happen in my own home, I think, oh my God, how many other people? I always like to say the trans community for me is that whole X-Men thing, is you need the special helmet to know where everybody is and to bring it together. But for me, it's like I want to get that message out immediately to kind of go, yeah, I'm reading the news too. I know you're out there, the person who just decided to transition, the person who's been transitioned for 30 years, the cross-dresser, the 10-year-old, the whatever, like you're out there. If I can get a message out that gets spread, then maybe I'm doing that much good in this political climate. But you do sacrifice some of the thoughtfulness of writing as a result, yeah.
Actually, I think that leads into what I was going to ask really nicely, because I had some questions about language, but also audience, right? And all of you have been sort of bringing those together. And I also wanted to thank Ernesto for opening with The Origin of Love, which is based on Plato's Symposium. And because there's this word that Heidegger has used, and it comes from the Greek poiesis. And it means bringing forth something from inside itself, right? It's bringing something into appearance. And it's this word poiesis, the word itself has shown up in trans discourse quite significantly, actually. It gets translated into things like self-organizing, self-creating, self-making. And I'm starting to wonder if poiesis is a kind of trans poetics, a kind of language, an embodied knowledge that turns into a language that trans people are fluent in and can understand, even if we aren't poets or authors, but we understand it and recognize it when we hear it. And so my question is, how much, as authors, as poets, as memoirists, how much attention do you give to the idea of translation or, time spent concerned about legibility to the audience beyond the trans reader, and how much do we even care? I mean, just to be blunt, does it need to be legible? And yet maybe it does, because illegibility is directly tied to trans death. But do we use these creative spaces to speak to each other? send out invitations to be received, phone calls waiting to be answered, right? Yeah, and I do think translation in various iterations has come up in all of your work, and I'd love for you to speak on those ideas.
I think that one of the, and I'm just going to speak to this program, one of the benefits that I've received from coming through these halls, coming through Goldwin Smith, is, if for nothing else, one thing I learned here was craft. One thing I learned here was how to make a poem stand up, how to make a poem, how the lines worked, how everything worked. I do martial arts as well. And, I've done martial arts all my life. In fact, I used to teach judo at Tegel. And you get to a point in your work where no matter what you do, it makes sense because you've been practicing so long. It looks like natural work, but it's actually the product of repetition, 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 repetition. And even when I left the program, I continued to work as a writer. So I can free myself up and not worry about legibility because I've spent so much practice time being legible. This just works for me. It's different for other people, but I've always kind of come through this, maybe with martial arts, that you practice so the crafted approach, the improbable approach, actually becomes instinct. And then from there, it becomes a valuable tool. You practice these forms until you can work with an unforeseen circumstance. And it looks like you're just acting off the cuff, but you have learned, how to respond artfully. And in the same way, I think that one thing that I'm really grateful this program is it made me work. And so when I speak with words and I respond to things, there's a certain amount of art to it now that I can't say I take for granted. I continue to nurture it, but it is something that, something that I'm very grateful for.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I often describe myself more as a translator than as a writer, at least in terms of the gender books, or as somebody who writes memoir or creative nonfiction but reads an awful lot of gender theory. Because when I really first started working with people in the trans community, it was mostly with cross-dressers. And I'm working class myself, and so communicating with people who had no access to theory, to higher ed, to basically this theory that had been around that was liberatory for them. They were still living in really narrow gender roles, in and the suffering, right? I mean, for me, it was a point of compassion to just go, here's bell hooks, here's Butler, but let me translate effectively. And doing that, for me, the art form is doing that without dumbing it down, which is hard to do. But I feel like that was really the most important or pivotal thing for me, was that I also have to say, as a working class person, never really felt like I had permission to write for my own self or my own satisfaction. And so working out the activism with the writing became its own kind of form of art, if that makes any sense.
In terms of who I love that idea from Heidegger, by the way. I don't know that I wasn't familiar with that, and that's very, very helpful, actually. Yeah, but in terms of audience, I think for me, writing has been a way to articulate myself from a place of not knowing, maybe with words, having a sense of who I am, but something needing to externalize, this way of kind of thinking aloud or being more in a physical realm, because I think as a young person, as a queer, gender ambiguous, I think just feeling safe in my body on a day-to-day, in a day-to-day experiential way was, I don't think I did. I mean, and that's something I'm still working on. And so I think writing has been a way to do that for myself. One of my great poetry teachers, Donald Ravel, used to say, don't write to be understood, but to understand. And I thought, yeah, of course, this cis straight, white dude is saying this and whatever. But on the other hand, I feel like there's something I resonated with that, because that has been my experience to write, to kind of understand myself. And then I think to trust the work, and to trust that the more honest I can be in that way, someone is going to be able to connect or relate with it in the same way that I was. I always just think about, one of the first books I really connected with as a young person, I was in like junior high or something, was Black Boy by Richard Wright. And, to think that I was this white, assigned female at birth kid, in the 90s, who was relating to this, Black Boy, like pre-civil rights era kind of novel. It's been a long time since I've read it, but I just remember being like, oh, I understand something about this being othered or being marginalized in this way. There's something really magical about literature and art that allows us to kind of have that sort of recognition. And so I think now, in terms of writing, I feel like the more work I can do to make myself legible to myself, to be able to recognize a sense of self that does, in some kind of, again, external way. And I think when the writing is really working for me, it feels like it's always been there. Like I'm not really writing, I'm just kind of uncovering something that's already there, and sort of trusting that process. And then, it seems inevitable that people are going to connect, or we'll get those emails, or someone will come up to us with this kind of relating in the same way that I've related to, so many other writers that have inspired and influenced me.
Just wanted to add one thing too, is it's weird how writing connects with other people. Like, for example, in my novel, I have a character who is an amputee, and I've been interviewed by Easter Seals to talk about writing characters that are otherly abled. I mean, I suffer from chronic pain, but that's not a visible disability. So I think that when we're starting to think about our audience, we have to understand that we might be speaking to a trans audience, but other people might be translating transness into other things and develop a sort of ownership with that work. I mean, I'm going to be speaking this November in front of a Buddhist conference because the Buddhists seem to dig my stuff. Maybe being Asian had something to do with it, but there it is. And but also the other thing, though, just talking about audience, is that in our communities, there's this urge, it seems, to canonize and to and to think this person is a celebrity or this person is a hero. And even here, I've gotten people who say, your work is, blah, blah, blah. And what I want to do is I never want my work to squelch the development of another writer. It's like, sure, I'm writing great, but you're probably going to write a story down the road that's going to say something even better or say something differently. So I think that one of the responsibilities that I found, and I don't know, is that not simply to exist as a writer, but to understand that I function as a guide, as a teacher, as somebody who is maybe a little older than you, but let's keep going. The water's warm. We want more people to be writing. So one does find this in the community where people are looking for heroes, and you've kind of got to step down from that pedestal and say, I'll accept older, I'll accept maybe a little bit of a guide, but there's nothing here that I do that if you have the talent and you have the perseverance that you can't also do.
Hey audience, would you like to ask our speaker some questions?
I'd like to bring the discussion around to publishing. Have you, as far as writing about transgender individuals or writing for the transgender community, do you find that the publishing community and the audiences, which are two different things, but the publishing community and the audiences are more open to reading about this sort of thing, or is there still this hesitancy, or I don't want to read about that sort of thing? How do you feel those waters are?
We're still fashionable like every couple of years, I'd argue.
Can you get the mic?
I mean, no, I'm loud. The idea that there's a consideration is still frustrating to me, because I feel like it's still, if it's not sort of a fetishized identity at any given moment in time, or there isn't, you know, a Jen or somebody out there, right, doing stuff, then there's not as much interest. And that's still very frustrating to me, because I think they're amazing. Like, I got into the mix at a time when it was so difficult to get anyone to listen to you about transness. I mean, 2003, my first book, we were doing research for the subtitles, and we couldn't use the word transgender because not enough people knew it. And so trying to get people a sense of how fast this has been, how quickly things have changed in terms of the language, in terms of an identity, but it's also because there's like a group of books published in 2004, and then it's 4 years before anything else does, and now it's starting to speed up. But really, when I started, I pretty much read everything that was written, and I can't read everything that was written in 3 weeks anymore, so that's awesome. But there's still more needed.
Yeah, I was just, actually I'm teaching a class right now on trans and genderqueer poetry, and I'm using this really great anthology edited by T.C. Tolbert and Trace Peterson called Troubling the Line, and just thinking about, that was published in I think 2012, and my first book came out in 2008, but I remember maybe the first interview I had someone asking me about, you know, what trans writers had influenced me, or specifically trans poets, and I literally didn't know a single one, and I think I knew of Hilda Raz, whose son is trans, and she has a book called Trans about, you know, and so that was kind of on my radar, and it's not like I mean, of course there were trans poets, but only since that, for me anyway, since that anthology came out, this whole world has kind of opened up. But I think it's a really interesting thing to think about, like, just the timing, like what time was, you know, I don't want to say right, but when people were, maybe a more general kind of public was able to, even know the word transgender, and you know, thank God for TC and Trace, because they did this amazing work, and now it's the same, like, there's just so many trans poets that I can't keep up. I'm trying to, but it's really interesting how publishing, and especially anthologies, which are problematic, I think, fundamentally, but how they're so necessary too, to kind of open up that conversation, just kind of as an archive, even to put things on the map. But it is a different time, just even 10 years ago, from 10 years ago.
I mean, just a couple of years ago, we were fighting. This is Lambda Literary, which is supposed to be the LGBT literary organization. There was no poetry category for transgender poetry, so we actually had to do a lot of fighting to get that in. This year, I was one of the judges for the transgender poetry category for the Lambda Awards. And what I saw in terms of the small presses that were making things, it was really exciting. Some of the work was extremely, extremely strong. It was varied. It was playing with form and genre. Some of it was incredibly formalist. Some of it was just way out there, and you know, it was exciting. So I think publishers as well as writers, there was a move towards queer publishing. As much as, you know, there were writers saying, I need to get my poem published, there were also publishers saying, I need to get these poems published. There's queer distribution, there are queer distributors, there's queer presses out there. So the work is beginning to get out, and it's beginning to get recognized. And I think that anybody right now who is writing somewhere on the margins, talking to all of you, when I was at Cornell, there was this feeling, I don't want to play that card. I want to just do it as a writer. No. Get your damn work in print. Yes. Somebody will notice it and things will happen. Like, this first book was actually the owner of a record company who I said, hey, you want to press? I can back the book up. And right now my next novel is, my writing was noticed, my next novel is going to be with a pretty darn mainstream publishing house. So, I mean, it happened because this particular book got read by one particular editor from Random House. And so now I've got this. What I'm saying is, look, you've only got one life, you've only got one writing career. If you're going to play the margins were shit to you in some ways, play them to your advantage now. Do what you can to get your work in print, and having to be Asian or having to be queer, or being a woman or anything else, be damned. Just do it. You will find your readers.
I mean, for the most part, there's so much struggle that comes out of all of those identity categories that I think I had the same experience of sort of being like, but I want to be appreciated because, you know, I'm a good writer, not because I'm trans. Whereas, you know, I didn't choose my subject matter. You know, it chose me, and I do think I see it as a gift now. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a way to really embrace your subject matter and also be, you know, a good writer and not just, you know, yeah.
Let's not forget all those white dudes benefited based on their gender and
Absolutely.
race.
Exactly, yeah.
You're not doing anything different.
Right.
Person in blue?
So I am also trans, but I'm also a writer. But I frequently run into a problem of like activism fatigue, or writing about the same subject over and over and over. And to a certain point, I think it's really important to do this kind of work, to get out and understand it. But it's kind of maybe exhausting writing about the same thing over and over, and especially with so personal. So I was wondering if you ever deal with that, or how you deal with that, especially do you ever feel like it's too much of a responsibility to write about these kind of issues, and you have to, take the burden on yourself to reach out to people who might be struggling with the gender identity?
I got advice a long time ago from Jameson Green, who I said the same thing basically. What do you do with basically activist fatigue? And he said, take a break. Seems dumb, but it really was like the most. I still have that voice in my head every time I'm like, I gotta do a thing, I gotta do a thing, I gotta do a thing. Like, you're not going to get to do everything that you'd like to do, and sometimes taking the energy and time to not just value, but sort of cherish yourself, right? That is a radical act all on its own, as someone who's marginalized. And so, yeah, take the time to do it. It's you're worth it, you know?
Also, the nice thing right now is you're not alone. So there are trans writers who write genre fiction, many good ones, just all sorts of things, poetry, fiction. So you don't really have to speak for everybody. Whatever you decide to write, there's probably some person who's trans who thinks, I wish I had seen that. And so they'll follow you. You don't have to worry about writing from the community. If your work is strong, a community will generate around you. So really, the other thing about it is, it's not boring if the story you're writing over and over and over is the one story you need to write. I still think a lot of times my entire work boils down to one poem that I've not figured out yet. So what I'm saying is, just don't worry so much about what people expect. I mean, that's a hard thing to say, I know, because there's so many people we think that we need to please. But at the end of the day, writing's boring. It hurts your back. It hurts your hands. So you might as well be doing it for something you love, because it's annoying. Nobody understands you. So do that, and be the first trans writer who writes about X, whatever X is, or be the one who writes in many different genres. We will follow you if the work is good, and we will exalt you for expanding what it means to be a trans writer. So don't worry, just as much as I can tell you, we need more people and more voices, and don't worry, I know how to read, I'll find you.
Yeah, I was just thinking about my first book of poems, Boy with Flowers, was very different than the one that was just published, and I think I had a similar sort of feeling, like I'd written this book that really sort of tracked my kind of self-understanding, figuring out that I'm trans and whatever. But the style of the new book is so different. So even though the subject matter is the same, the approach is very different, and I think actually it's much more playful, even though there's seriousness to it. But like I mentioned, I'm kind of collaging and taking from all these different genres. There's the first piece in there. It has stuff about sleep paralysis and alien abduction and the supernatural and what else? An LSD trip, and and it has to do with, and it's all gender stuff too. And so I think there are ways to kind of keep it interesting for yourself, and I also think that even when you were reading the piece about your mother's death, I just thought this, you said, okay, back to the gender stuff. But I was thinking, yeah, but this perspective is a very particular, queer, genderqueer, kind of point of view that that I could, so there's something about that lens, or the kind of forms that we choose, because we're already, I think, interested in, what is embodiment? What is it to be in a trans body or a genderqueer body? And that's really what we're doing when we're writing, is we're making these forms. We're making these other bodies to kind of inhabit for a while. And so I think there's a lot of, for me anyway, there's a big relationship between the form and content kind of question. But it actually feels sort of, this is maybe the one way in which like identity doesn't feel limiting, or reductive, is to be able to write poems, because then it actually feels like meaning or possibility proliferate rather than sort of shut down.
I just wanted to jump in that on a follow-up that on the publishing question that sort of ties in with this as well. Maybe Masha can speak about this a bit, about just the sort of context of the trend in trans literature. That yes, there are a lot of publishing opportunities that are actually pretty recent, and that a lot of what proliferated in the past few decades were memoirs, because that's all that publishers would publish. And Julia Jacques has said that. She had other work, but all that publishers were interested were in a memoir and a single story. And Ryan Salmons, who wrote Second Son, also had done a larger body of work, but the publisher only wanted his personal life story, and that's what got published. And I know all of you have done, autobiographical and biographical material that has, maybe expanded or shaped poetically in different ways. I don't know, maybe you can speak about that sort of movement that was so zeroed in on memoir because of a cis audience desiring it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, just when it turns to memoir, that really, and that sort of thing really struck me as very white. Most of the memoirs are written by white folk, and I thought that that's just what they did, and so I never really cared. I was, so the weird thing about, and this is just before we leave, I just want to take that up, the trans POC experience is quite different in a lot of, in many ways from the, the white trans experience. So that particular, nobody cared about what an Asian would think about this. They wanted something, so there wasn't even a need. So my thing vis-a-vis this was, in fact, before that, I didn't even think it could be trans because I thought that was just a white thing. When I figured out that I could actually do it, it's like, cool. But when I did it, I kind of bypassed all that stuff because that really had nothing to do with me. And now I look back and say maybe it did somehow, but I just thought I wanted to give a shout out. POC, different experience. Okay.
Yeah, we're starting to get the cut it off signal. We were wondering if there's one last question that people in the audience might want to ask.
This one's for Eli. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned that you're not sure you would write poems if you weren't born queer or trans. I'm wondering if you think that the urge to write poetry, or perhaps write in general, arises necessarily from oppression or facing oppression, perhaps identifying with the marginalized.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for other folks or where that comes from. It's definitely something that I've wondered about for myself, for sure. Yeah, it's hard to say if I hadn't been born the way I am, and I think that there is something about, I don't want to say all literature, but definitely whatever that sense of, outsider or like loner, or just that is a kind of theme just that has appealed to me, that does feel like a pretty common one. I also feel like, though, it's a very human one, to just maybe not feel like you're part of the group, or maybe there's like desire or longing to be, part of a group, or but I don't know. I wonder if you all have responses to this.
I feel like there's a really easy segue to let's go upstairs and eat food. food for free and be part of a group together.
There's a conversation upstairs.
Upstairs has
Sure.
a lounge.
Yeah.
So if you get the books, I can sign them for you. So let's give one last round of applause.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.